My in-laws called me useless for years, laughed behind my back, and treated me like I didn't belong in their family, until the day they saw whose name was on the checks that kept their precious world afloat. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emma Carter. I married Daniel Carter when I was 26. Daniel was the kind of man who always wanted his parents' approval. No matter what happened, he needed them to see him as successful. At first, I thought it was just normal family closeness, but over time, I realized it was something much heavier. His parents, Richard and Susan, had a way of controlling every part of his life, and by extension, mine. Richard was a man who measured people only by how much money they made and how important they seemed to others. He talked like a businessman, even when he was just sitting at the dinner table. Susan, on the other hand, was quieter, but her words carried sharp edges. She smiled while cutting me down. They never came right out and said I wasn't welcome, but their actions told me everything. When I first started joining family dinners, they didn't bother to hide their judgment. Richard would ask Daniel about his job, his goals, his plans, but when it came to me, he barely looked in my direction. If I tried to join the conversation, he would change the subject. Susan would ask about little things like whether I had cooked a meal or cleaned the house, but never once about my own work or interests. The worst part was the comparisons. Susan had a way of bringing up Daniel's ex-girlfriend at the most painful moments. She'd say things like, "Oh, remember how Michelle used to host such lovely dinners?" Or Michelle always knew how to handle herself in social situations. It wasn't subtle. It was her way of telling me I wasn't enough. Richard didn't need words. He just laughed under his breath whenever I spoke, as if my opinions were pointless. Daniel would shift uncomfortably during those moments, but he never really defended me. He'd just smile awkwardly or change the subject, pretending nothing happened. That silence hurt more than their insults. It made me feel like I was alone at a table where I should have been part of the family. It became clear that in their eyes, I was nothing more than a woman who had married into their family without bringing anything of value. They assumed I was a burden, someone who lived off their son's efforts. They never asked about my work, never gave me the chance to explain what I did, and never cared to see me as more than what they imagined. Every dinner, every gathering, I sat there quietly, listening to their small digs and forced laughter, all while keeping my feelings buried. To them, I was useless. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that one day they would learn the truth. And when that day came, the shock on their faces would be worth every insult I had swallowed in silence. I worked long hours at a small accounting firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me. I liked keeping things in order, solving problems, and making sure every dollar lined up where it should. The pay wasn't huge at first, but I was careful. I saved as much as I could, cutting corners on myself when I had to. No one in Daniel's family ever asked me about it, and I didn't offer much. I learned early on that whatever I said, they would twist into something small. It was easier to keep my work to myself. Daniel knew what I did, of course, but even with him, I didn't talk much about my career. I had dreams and plans, but they weren't the kind of things I could share at that time. I wanted to grow, maybe one day start something of my own, but I kept those thoughts close. Every time I thought about saying more, I imagined Richard's smirk or Susan's half-smile, and the words just stayed inside. They wanted me to be quiet, so I let them think I was. There were moments when Daniel tried to stand up for me, but they never lasted. Richard had a way of shutting him down with a single laugh, and Susan could guilt him with just a look. I saw it happen too many times. Daniel would start to speak up, maybe say something like, "Emma works hard," but then his father would scoff or his mother would sigh, and the fight would drain right out of him. He wanted peace with them more than he wanted to defend me. One evening at dinner, I carried a plate into the kitchen and heard Susan's voice before I stepped in. She was talking to Richard, her tone soft but sharp. "She's a burden," Susan said, not even lowering her voice. "Daniel deserves someone who can actually contribute." The words landed like a slap. I froze where I stood, holding that plate, trying not to breathe too loudly. Richard didn't argue. He just muttered something about Daniel needing to be smarter about his choices. Then Susan laughed lightly, as if it was a joke. I stood there until I knew my face wouldn't give me away, then walked back and like nothing had happened. That night, lying in bed beside Daniel, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, hearing her voice over and over again. "A burden. That was what they thought of me. I wanted to shake Daniel, to tell him what I heard, to ask him why he never fought for me. But I stayed quiet. I knew the answer. He didn't want to be in the middle. He would tell me to ignore it, to not take it personally. I didn't forget, though. If anything, those words lit something inside me. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to beg for their respect. Instead, I would keep moving forward. I would work harder, save more, and build something so strong that one day, their words would turn to ash in their mouths. They thought I was small, but they had no idea what I was capable of. Thanksgiving at the Carter's house was always loud, crowded, and filled with too much food. Susan decorated the place like it was a magazine spread, and Richard made sure everyone knew how much he had paid for the turkey, the wine, the silverware. Their relatives gathered around the table, laughing and talking, while I sat there doing my best to blend into the background. The meal was halfway through when it happened. Richard leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, and looked right at me. His voice carried over the table. "Tell me, Emma," he said, "what do you even bring to this family? Honestly, what do you bring to the table?" The laughter around us died down. I felt every eye turn in my direction. My fork froze in my hand, and my chest tightened. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence was worse than the insult. Richard smirked, clearly pleased with himself. I turned to Daniel, waiting for him to say something, anything. To tell his father to stop, to remind him that I worked hard, that I mattered. But Daniel didn't. He stared at his plate, moving food around with his fork, as if pretending not to hear. My heart sank in that moment. It wasn't just Richard humiliating me. It was Daniel letting it happen. I sat through the rest of dinner in a haze. The relatives tried to keep the conversation moving, but the sting stayed with me. Every laugh around the table sounded distant. Every bite of food felt like sand in my mouth. I smiled when I had to, nodding politely, but inside something broke. When we got home that night, I didn't bring it up. I didn't cry or argue. What would be the point? Daniel would only say I was overreacting, or that his father didn't mean it like that. I had heard it all before. The truth was clear. Daniel would never protect me from them. I was on my own. That realization hurt more than the insult itself. For years, I had tried to win a place in their family, to show them I was worthy. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I stayed patient, one day they would see me differently. But Thanksgiving made it clear that day would never come. No matter what I did, in their eyes, I would always be useless. Lying awake that night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would stop looking to them for validation. I would stop waiting for Daniel to fight battles he was too afraid to fight. I would stand on my own. They thought I was powerless, but they were wrong. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was independence. What I needed was to build something they could never ignore. They thought their words would break me. Instead, they gave me the reason to rise. After that Thanksgiving, I changed the way I looked at everything. I stopped waiting for respect and started planning for myself. I still worked at the accounting firm during the day, but at night, when Daniel went to bed, I stayed up at the kitchen table with my laptop. I had the skills to do more, and I wasn't going to waste them. At first, I took on small side jobs, helping friends of friends with taxes, giving advice to small business owners who couldn't afford a big firm. I charged less than anyone else, but I made sure I did the work better than they expected. One client led to another. People started recommending me quietly, and little by little, my list of clients grew. I didn't spend much. Every dollar I earned outside my regular job went right back into my work. I bought better software, better tools, even paid for courses to sharpen my skills. Some nights I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but I forced myself to keep going. The long hours, the missed sleep, it didn't matter. Each step forward felt like proof that I was building something real. The years slipped by faster than I expected. What began as a handful of side jobs grew into something solid. I registered my own consulting business, took on bigger clients, and soon realized I was making more money on my own than I ever had at the firm. I still didn't tell Daniel. Not because I wanted to hide it forever, but because I knew how things worked in his family. If he knew, they would know, and if they knew, they would try to tear it down before it had the chance to stand on its own. So I kept it to myself. To Daniel, I was just busy with extra work. To his parents, I was still the woman they thought did nothing. Every time we went to family gatherings, it was the same routine. Susan would hand me an apron the second I walked through the door, as if I had come only to serve. Richard would talk business with Daniel and the other men, never looking in my direction. If I tried to sit and relax, Susan would ask me to set the table, carry trays, wash dishes. I became their unpaid help at every holiday, and they didn't thank me for it once. I let them think what they wanted. Inside, I smiled, because while they saw me as invisible, I knew the truth. My work was growing stronger every month. I had clients who trusted me, numbers in my bank account climbing higher, and plans that reached further than they could imagine. They mocked me for being useless, but without even realizing it, they were pushing me toward a future where I wouldn't need them, or even Daniel, at all. And the longer they underestimated me, the sweeter it was going to be when the truth finally came out. It started with little things. Daniel would ask if I could cover the electric bill, or if I could pay for groceries that week because his paycheck was a little tight. I didn't mind at first. I was making enough through my business to handle it, and I thought of us as a team. What was mine was his too, or at least that's how I saw it. But over time, his requests grew bigger. He asked me to cover the mortgage once, then the car payment, and eventually he was coming to me for help every month. I didn't complain. I just paid what needed to be paid and kept building my business quietly in the background. He never asked where the money was coming from, and I never told him. Then came the day that changed everything. Richard had some new investment opportunity and called the whole family together to talk about it. He was always chasing big projects, always bragging about the money he planned to make. That afternoon, he sat at the head of the table, papers spread out, talking about how each of his children should contribute. When he got to Daniel, his tone sharpened. "You're my eldest. You need to step up and show some responsibility. It's time for you to put real money into this family project." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I knew he didn't have the money. He had been relying on me for months. I thought maybe he would admit it, or at least say he couldn't do it right now. But instead, he opened his mouth and said something I'll never forget. "Emma doesn't make enough for us to contribute." The words hit me like ice water. The room went quiet. Richard sighed and shook his head, muttering about dead weight. Susan pursed her lips and gave me that familiar look of pity disguised as kindness. I couldn't believe it. After everything I had done to support Daniel, he threw me under the bus in front of everyone. He could have said he wasn't in a position to invest. He could have admitted he wasn't managing his own money well. But instead, he made me the excuse. He made me the problem. I sat there, holding back the sting in my eyes, pretending his words didn't cut as deeply as they did. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't just his parents anymore. It was him. The man I had married, the man I thought was supposed to protect me, had turned on me to save himself. That night, when we got home, I didn't argue with him. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask why he said it. Instead, I grew quiet. I stopped looking at him the same way. I went through the motions of being a wife, but inside, I began pulling away. I poured everything into my business. Every ounce of anger, every moment of hurt, it all went into growing what I had started. I stopped waiting for Daniel to notice me, to stand up for me, to choose me. He already had chosen, and it wasn't me. From that moment forward, I wasn't building for us anymore. I was building for myself. My business grew faster than I ever expected. What started with a handful of clients turned into something much bigger the day I signed my first contract with a nationwide chain. They had dozens of locations across the country, and they needed someone to manage their finances in a way that was smarter and more efficient. Out of all the names they could have chosen, they picked mine. I worked day and night to make sure I delivered more than they asked for, and when I did, word spread quickly. With that one contract, everything changed. Money began flowing in at a pace I had never seen before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just comfortable, I was secure. I didn't rush out to spend it, though. Instead, I thought carefully about every dollar. I bought properties, investing in rental homes that would bring me income for years to come. I met with people who understood the markets better than I did and made sure my money was placed in the right places. I reinvested into my business, hiring a small team to help me handle the growing workload. Piece by piece, I was building an empire, quietly. To Daniel and his parents, nothing seemed different. At home, I kept the same routines. I dressed simply, cooked dinner, and worked late into the night like I always had. I didn't show off anything I had. I drove the same old car, wore the same clothes, and smiled when Susan made her comments. When they asked, I said my job kept me busy, but never gave details. They assumed I was still scraping by, working extra hours just to make ends meet. Richard liked to mock me openly during family gatherings. "She's probably clipping coupons just to afford that salad she brings," he'd say with a laugh. Susan would shake her head and add, "Well, at least she tries." The others around the table would chuckle awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable, but no one ever spoke up. Not even Daniel. I let them talk. I let them laugh. Every insult rolled off me more easily now because I knew the truth. I had money in the bank, investments growing every day, and a business that was on its way to becoming one of the most trusted in its field. I didn't need to prove anything to them in that moment. The longer they believed I was useless, the sweeter it would be when the truth finally came out. So I played the role. I smiled when they dismissed me, nodded when they compared me to people I had never met, and carried trays of food like I was their servant. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that calm, I was waiting for the right time, the perfect moment, to show them who I really was. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was small. What they didn't know was that I was already standing taller than all of them combined. Daniel had always prided himself on his job. He liked the title, the steady paycheck, and the way it made him look in front of his parents. But pride doesn't fix bad decisions. One mistake turned into two, and before long, the company he worked for had no choice but to let him go. He came home one evening with his tie loose, his face pale, and told me the news in a flat voice. At first, I felt sorry for him. Losing a job is never easy. But that sympathy faded quickly when I saw where he turned for help. Instead of sitting down with me and figuring things out together, Daniel ran straight to his parents. He told them everything, hoping they would back him up, maybe even lend him money until he found something else. Richard didn't hold back. "I told you to be smarter," he snapped. "This is what happens when you don't think ahead." Susan chimed in, shaking her head. "And with Emma not contributing, what do you expect? You should have chosen differently." I wasn't even in the room when they said it, but Daniel came home and repeated their words to me, as if it was somehow my fault he lost his job. That cut deeper than I expected. All those years of being called useless, and now he was letting them pile their blame on me again. Behind closed doors, though, the story was different. Daniel knew exactly who had been carrying more than her share. Late at night, he came to me, his voice quieter, more desperate. "Emma, I just need a little help. Just for now. You've always been good with money. Can you cover things until I get back on my feet?" I looked at him, remembering every family dinner where he stayed silent while I was humiliated. I remembered the Thanksgiving where he let his father mock me in front of everyone. I remembered the day he told his parents I didn't make enough, when in truth I had been the one keeping us afloat. So I told him no. Calmly, without anger, without shouting. Just no. He stared at me like he couldn't believe what I said. "What do you mean, no? You've always helped before." This time, I didn't bend. I reminded him of the years he never defended me, of the way he allowed his parents to treat me as if I was nothing. I told him he had made his choice every time he chose their approval over my respect. He could go back to them for help, because he wasn't going to get it from me anymore. Inside, I felt a cold strength I hadn't felt before. For years, they had held all the power, and Daniel had let them. But now things were shifting. This was my chance to take back control, to flip the balance. They thought I was weak. They thought I was useless. But soon, they would see exactly how wrong they were. Richard's business had always seemed untouchable. He loved to brag about how strong it was, how smart his decisions were, and how others could only dream of reaching his level. But even the strongest walls crack when the foundation is weak. His company started bleeding money. Deals fell through, projects stalled, and soon everyone in the family knew there was trouble, even though Richard tried to pretend otherwise. Finally, he called for a family meeting. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Susan set the table, but the mood in the room was nothing like the usual gatherings. No laughter, no small talk. Just tension. Richard sat at the head, chest puffed up, papers spread out in front of him. He looked at Daniel first, then at the others, his voice carrying the same arrogance as always. "Yes, we've had a few setbacks," he said, waving his hand like it was nothing. "But I've secured big investors. This company will survive, stronger than ever." He leaned back, confident, waiting for everyone to admire his words. No one asked who the investors were. They didn't dare. Richard had built his life on making others feel small, and no one wanted to be the one to challenge him. Susan smiled her polite smile, as if everything was already solved. Daniel shifted nervously beside me, clearly unsure of what was coming. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. When Richard finished his speech, I spoke. That's true. You do have big investors. But maybe you should tell them who's been keeping the lights on. The room stilled. Richard's eyebrows pulled together, his face tightening. What are you talking about? He asked sharply. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Slowly, carefully, I laid the signed checks on the table. My name, Emma Carter, was written clearly across every one. I slid them toward him, the sound of paper brushing against with the only noise in the room. For once, Richard didn't have a reply. His mouth opened, then closed again. Susan leaned forward, her eyes wide, scanning the checks as if they might vanish if she blinked too long. Daniel stared at me, his face pale, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt in that house. All the years of being called useless, all the times they had dismissed me, all the moments they made me feel like I didn't matter, they all came crashing into that single pause. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there, steady, letting them take it in. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking under their words. They were the ones shrinking under mine, and I hadn't even said anything yet. Their empire was crumbling, and the woman they had spent years mocking was the only one holding it up. Richard's face turned red as he stared at the checks, his lips pressed tight like he had swallowed something bitter. Susan looked pale, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the papers, her eyes moving over my name again and again as if hoping she had read it wrong. The arrogance that usually filled the room was gone. What replaced it was silence, shock, and the kind of panic they couldn't hide. Daniel was the first to speak. He leaned forward, forcing a laugh that sounded weak. I always knew Emma was capable. I told you all along she was smarter than you gave her credit for. His voice cracked at the edges, desperate to put himself on my side now that the truth was out. I turned to look at him, and he must have seen it in my eyes, the years of hurt, the years of being dismissed and ignored. No, Daniel, I said softly but firmly. You didn't believe in me. You stayed silent. Every single time. The air in the room grew heavy again. I looked at Richard and Susan, my voice steady. Do you remember the dinners where you laughed at me? Do you remember when you asked me what I even brought to the table? Do you remember calling me a burden? You all made it clear what you thought of me. And Daniel, you sat there and let it happen. Susan tried to interrupt, her voice trembling. Emma, you know we didn't mean. I cut her off with a shake of my head. You meant every word. You wanted me to feel small, and you succeeded for a long time. But here we are now, and you can't rewrite what happened. Daniel opened his mouth again, fumbling for words, but I didn't give him the chance. Do you know what it's like? I asked, looking straight at him. To hear your own husband use you as an excuse? To sit at a table while his parents tear you down and watch him do nothing? I remember every moment. And I will never forget it. Richard leaned back in his chair, no clever remark left in him. His hands rested on the table, clenched tight, as though holding in the frustration of losing control. Susan's eyes dropped to her lap, too ashamed to meet mine. For the first time, I wasn't the one being put in my place. I wasn't the one feeling small. The power that had always been theirs now sat with me. They knew it and I knew it, but I didn't need to raise my voice or brag. The truth was enough. The checks with my name on them were enough. They had called me useless. They had treated me like nothing. And now, in the one moment that mattered most, they saw me for what I was, the person holding their future in my hands. Richard finally cleared his throat, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. So, what happens now? It was the first time he had spoken without confidence, the first time he wasn't giving orders. I leaned forward, steady and calm. What happens now is simple. I'll keep this company alive, but only on my terms. I take a controlling stake. I get full authority over decisions. And I answer to no one but myself. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew he couldn't. Susan opened her mouth as if to plead, but I raised my hand to stop her. No more excuses. No more insults. If you want me involved, you respect my place. Otherwise, you can watch this company collapse. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They would agree, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. For years, I had been treated as if I was disposable. Now, I was the only one standing between them and ruin. I turned to Daniel. He looked lost, shifting in his seat like a child caught in the middle of a fight. And you, I said, my voice colder now. You need to make a choice. Either you stand with me, or you crawl back to them. But I won't live as anyone's excuse ever again. Not yours. Not theirs. His face fell. He tried to smile, tried to say something sweet, but I didn't soften. I waited. He said nothing. I gathered the folder, slid the rest of the papers back inside, and stood. I'm not your burden. I never was. I was the one keeping this family afloat while you all laughed at me. That ends today. No one moved as I walked to the door. Richard's hands were still pressed flat against the table, Susan's head hung low, and Daniel stared at the ground. For once, I was the one leaving the room with power, not shame. The cool air outside hit my face, and I lifted my head high. I wasn't the quiet woman who sat at their table, shrinking under their laughter. I wasn't the wife waiting for scraps of respect. I was the one who had built something real, something untouchable. The same family that had mocked me for years, that had called me useless, would now answer to me. They would take my calls, follow my terms, and depend on the checks with my name at the bottom. And I would make sure they never forgot it. I had waited in silence long enough. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simply the truth laid bare. I was never useless. I was the one in control. And now, every time they looked at me, they would see the woman who signed the checks that kept their world alive.